Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is something out there, drifting in the dark between the stars, that has ended civilizations. Not just wars, not just empires, whole civilizations, plural, across the entire span of the galaxy, rendered into nothing but silence and dust. And right now, in the grim-dark age of the 41st millennium, the age of the Great Rift, the age of the psychic awakening, the conditions that once allowed this thing to nearly wipe out all intelligent life in the Milky Way are coming together again, slowly and quietly, like a tide coming in at night, while everyone is looking somewhere else. There are 100 apocalypses happening in Warhammer 40,000 at any given moment. Hive fleets descending from the void, consuming biospheres and leaving barren rock behind. Chaos gods tearing holes in the fabric of reality and pouring demonic legions through. The ancient, undead machine gods waking from 60 million year slumbers and reaching for the stars with cold metal hands. The Imperium of man is the largest human civilization in the history of the species, and it is losing ground on every front simultaneously. Its billion soldiers and its million warships and its 10,000 years of accumulated doctrine stretched impossibly thin across a galaxy that has never stopped trying to kill everything that lives within it. And yet, even within that context, even in a setting defined by existential horror piled on top of existential horror, there is something that the Inquisition considers particularly dangerous to think about. Something that doesn't get talked about much, that doesn't have a dedicated codex or a range of miniatures or a dramatic place in the rotating cycle of major faction releases. Something that was introduced in the very first edition of this game, acknowledged, filed away, and largely left in the deep lore for those patient enough to dig for it. The Imperium of man knows about this threat. The Inquisition keeps files on it, locked behind layers of clearance and secrecy, hidden from the wider public. Most Space Marines will never hear its name spoken aloud during their lifetimes. Most Imperial citizens live and die without ever knowing such a thing exists. And that might actually be fine, because awareness of this creature is no protection from it. Knowing it exists won't save you. Your psyker neighbor might already be compromised right now, in this moment, while their minds slowly being bent and hollowed out from the inside, their body preparing for a transformation so horrifying that even the texts that describe it use careful, measured language. The kind of language people use when they desperately want to sound calm and detached, while describing something absolutely unbearable. The creature has many names. Different species across the galaxy, over the course of millions of years, have encountered it and come up with their own words for what it is. Some call them sirens, others call them Krell, and the formal academic term used in certain inquisitorial archives is a Latin-derived phrase, spiritus subjugator, which translates roughly as spirit enslaver, and has exactly the kind of dry clinical accuracy that inquisitorial taxonomy strives for, while completely failing to capture the visceral reality of what the thing actually does. Some call them dominators, or puppeteers, but the name that has stuck in most Imperial records, the one that most clearly describes what these things do to you and everyone you love, is the name humanity settled on, the Enslavers. Welcome back to Q on 40K, and tonight we are going deep. Not just into a faction's history or a battle's outcome, but into the cosmological bedrock of this entire setting, into a chapter of galactic history so old and so catastrophic that it makes everything happening in the 41st millennium look like a local weather event by comparison. We are going to sit with one of the oldest, most quietly terrifying pieces of lore in all of Warhammer 40,000. A story that stretches back 60 million years before the present day. A story that touches almost every major faction in the game. A story that shaped the modern galaxy in ways that most players never stop to think about. We're going to talk about what the Enslavers are, where they came from, what they do, how they nearly ended all life in the galaxy once before, and, perhaps most disturbingly, why the galaxy right now might be more vulnerable to them than it has been since that ancient catastrophe first unfolded. So get comfortable. Make yourself a drink. The lights can stay on if you prefer. This story doesn't require darkness to be frightening. It carries its own. Take a comfortable breath. We have a long road ahead of us. But I promise you, by the time we're done, you'll look at every unsanctioned psyker, every warp breach, every unregistered psychic awakening across the Imperium in a completely different light. Because once, a very long time ago, a civilization far older and wiser than the Imperium of man made a mistake. They created too many psychic beings, too quickly, in too short a time. The warp flooded. Something came through the cracks between dimensions. And almost nothing survived. Let that thought settle for a moment. Almost nothing. In the entire galaxy. Not a single major civilization left standing. Not a network of survivors holding on to rebuild. Not a heroic last stand that bought enough time for the next generation. Almost nothing. 60 million years ago. Doesn't that feel like the kind of thing that should be remembered? Doesn't it seem like exactly the sort of catastrophic, species-ending event that every surviving civilization would carve into their bones as a warning, would encode into the deepest layers of their culture as an absolute and non-negotiable commandment? Whatever you do, don't let this happen again. And yet, somehow, here we are in the 41st millennium, making eerily similar choices. Breeding psychic soldiers for a desperate war. Letting the barriers between reality and the warp thin and crack and bleed because the war demands it. Generating unsanctioned psychers faster than the systems designed to contain them can keep pace. Something is watching that process from the other side of those cracks. It has the patience of something that lives in the warp, where time moves differently, where 60 million years of waiting is simply the interval between opportunities. Something is very, very patient. Before we begin the history, I want to give you a single image to hold on to throughout this video, because I think it captures the enslavers better than any amount of technical description. Imagine a world full of people going about their lives, billions of them in a hive city, working and eating and sleeping and arguing and loving each other. Yet now imagine that somewhere in that city, one person has been quietly changed. They don't know it yet. They still feel mostly like themselves. Just tired, just a little off. And in 3 days, their body will tear itself apart and become a door. And through that door, something will step that wants to repeat the process with everyone else in the city. And by the time anyone realizes what's happening, there will be 100 doors, then 1,000. And each one is made from what was once a person. Now you have a sense of what we're dealing with. Let's begin. Part 1. Before the beginning. The galaxy primordial. To understand the enslavers, to really feel the weight of what they represent, you have to go back, all the way back. Back to a time so distant from the present that 60 million years might as well be an abstraction. Yet a number too large to hold in the mind comfortably. But try to imagine the Milky Way galaxy without any of the civilizations we know. No Imperium, no Aeldari craft worlds. No Necron dynasties stirring in their tomb worlds, no orcs, no Tau, no Tyrannid hive fleets, nothing of what we recognize as the modern galaxy. What you have instead is something genuinely beautiful and genuinely strange. At the very heart of this ancient era, there was a species, or perhaps more accurately, a collection of species, so old that even calling them ancient feels inadequate. They had been crossing the stars when the first complex organisms were still negotiating what it meant to have a spine. They had built civilizations while the continents of Earth were still sliding around trying to figure out their arrangement, as they are referred to in the collected lore of the 41st millennium simply as the Old Ones, though their slan descendants and other echoes of their influence sometimes called them the First Ones, or something that doesn't translate cleanly into any human language at all. The Old Ones were, by any reasonable definition, gods. Not the false gods of chaos, not the hungry and violent star predators that would later be called the Satan, but something older and stranger than either of those things. They were cold-blooded reptilians by appearance, slow, patient, deliberate creatures who had apparently been alive long enough to develop the temperament of something that simply does not need to rush. They had mastered the warp in an era when the warp was still mostly safe. At the psychic dimension that underlies all of reality, the dimension that the Imperium later came to call the Immaterium, the Sea of Souls, the Empyrean. In those days, it was a calmer place. It reflected the emotions and psychic energies of living things, yes, but without the howling malice that characterizes it today. Before the birth of the Chaos Gods, before suffering on a galactic scale saturated the warp with rage and despair and hunger. In the beginning, the warp was something closer to a mirror, vast and deep, but not inherently predatory. The Old Ones used this warp with a mastery that nothing has matched since. They built the webway, that extraordinary network of stable tunnels through the Immaterium, corridors carved into the fabric of reality itself, allowing instantaneous travel between distant stars without exposing travelers to the full chaotic current of the warp. Think about what this means for a moment. Other civilizations, including the Imperium of Man, have to brave the full force of the warp when they travel between stars, navigating the psychic ocean storms and currents and predatory entities with the help of navigators, the light of the Astronomicon, and an enormous amount of carefully engineered Geller fields to keep the warp at bay. The Old Ones simply stepped from one side of the galaxy to the other, through a corridor that was as safe and predictable as a hallway in your own home. The webway was perhaps their greatest single achievement, a masterwork of dimensional engineering so complex and so elegant that even the most technologically advanced species of the 41st millennium can only use fragments of it, and those only incompletely and imperfectly. The Eldari, who inherited significant portions of the webway from the Old Ones, still regard it as the most precious legacy of their creators, and as they moved through their webway across the galaxy, the Old Ones seeded worlds with life. This is the aspect of the Old Ones that tends to get lost in the drama of what follows, but it matters enormously to understand what they were actually doing and why. The Old Ones were, at their deepest level, gardeners. Patient, slow, cosmically far-sighted gardeners who looked out at the vast and mostly silent galaxy and saw potential in it everywhere they looked. Yet the evidence suggests they were genuinely dedicated to this project. They found worlds where life was possible and they encouraged it, nudging the conditions toward what was needed, occasionally seeding more complex organisms, checking back over generations to see how things were developing. They were not passive observers. They intervened actively, shaping the development of species across the galaxy with a care that suggested they genuinely valued what they were creating. The ancestors of humanity, small primate-like creatures on a minor world in an unremarkable star system at the galaxy's edge, were among their projects. Here the Slan, the philosophical and magical heirs of the Old Ones who appear in Warhammer fantasy lore, but are referenced in 40K as descendants of the Old Ones' civilization, owed their existence to this same patient cultivation. The galaxy they shaped was, by all accounts, a garden in the truest sense of the word, rich, diverse, teeming with life at various stages of development across 100,000 worlds. The Old Ones cultivated it with the long view of beings who had been alive for so long that geological epochs were merely seasons to them. They appear to have had no particular military interest, no desire for conquest or domination in the conventional sense. They were explorers and creators first, beings for whom the act of bringing new forms of consciousness into the universe was apparently its own justification. Thus, there is something almost unbearably sad about what comes next. Viewed from this angle, the Old Ones created something beautiful. They spent millions of years doing it, and the catastrophe that destroyed them was born not from their failures, but from their desperation to protect it. Born from the moment they started sacrificing wisdom for urgency, restraint for speed, caution for survival. But that disaster was still a long way off. Before the final catastrophe, there was the war. And before the war, there were the Necrontyre, a people so defined by their suffering that their very existence was a wound waiting to find somewhere to bleed. Part 2. The War in Heaven. seeds of catastrophe. The Necrontyre fought the Old Ones. More than once, actually. The first conflict ended as you would expect a war between a recently spacefaring species of mortals and an entity that had been a galactic power for millions of years to end. With the Necrontyre pushed back, humiliated, driven to the outer dark of the galaxy's halo stars, their internal unity, which had been forged precisely by the pressure of having an external enemy to focus on, fractured. The old divisions returned. What had been one angry civilization became several angry factions, turning on each other in cycles of civil war that the historians of the period, to the extent that anyone kept records in those days, called the Wars of Secession. This state of affairs might have persisted indefinitely, with the Necrontyre slowly destroying themselves from within while the Old Ones continued their patient gardening of the galaxy's interior. History had other ideas. The Necrontyre, in their exploration of the stars surrounding their radiation-blasted homeworlds, encountered something living in the suns, something vast and old and utterly alien, entities of living stellar energy that drifted through solar plasma, the way whales drifted through oceans, massive, indifferent, and occasionally predatory toward the smaller things that wandered too close. The Necrontyre called these beings the Citan, which translates roughly to star gods in their ancient tongue, and the name was appropriate in a way that even its creators didn't fully appreciate. Yes, the Citan were entities of such immense energy that they had no physical form in the conventional sense, simply swirling intelligences of plasma and radiation and hunger. The Citan were ancient, older than the Old Ones, some sources suggest, though the warp held no memory of them, and the Imperium registered their presence only as a kind of absence, a silence where the souls of all the beings they had consumed over the eons should have been echoing. The Citan were, fundamentally, devourers. They fed on the life energies of organic beings, the subtle emanations of consciousness and soul that leached into the warp from living minds. To a Citan, a civilization was a larder. A galaxy was a feast. The bargain that followed was one of the most catastrophically short-sighted choices in all of galactic history. And that is genuinely saying something in a setting as comprehensively terrible as Warhammer 40,000. The Necrontyre approached the Citan with an offer of collaboration. They would build the Citan physical bodies, shells of a living metal alloy called necrodermis, that would allow these energy beings to interact with the material universe more directly, to feed more efficiently. In exchange, the Citan would lend the Necrontyre their power and help them defeat the Old Ones. And crucially, somewhere in this arrangement came the promise of immortality, not just long life, not merely extended years. True, absolute immortality, the permanent ending of the Necrontyre's generational curse of death and decay. The price was everything, absolutely everything. Through a ritual of biotransference, a process so invasive and so permanent that it constituted, in every meaningful sense, the death of the Necrontyre as a biological species. The flesh and blood and soul of every living Necrontyre was poured out and replaced. Their consciousness was transferred into bodies of necrodermis, the same living metal that clothed the Citan. They became the Necrons, undying, unkillable, essentially immune to disease and time and the ravages of environment, immortal, as promised. The problem, one of several catastrophically large problems, was that this process was irreversible. The bodies they had built and occupied were impressive, powerful, durable beyond any organic frame. But they could not grow. They could not reproduce. They could not eat or breathe, or experience the thousands of small sensory pleasures that constitute what it actually feels like to be alive. And the souls that had once animated those organic bodies, the psychic impressions, the deep self, had been almost entirely consumed in the process of biotransference, swallowed by the Citan as payment. The Necrontyre had traded their souls for metal bodies and eternal life, and in doing so had become something that could endure forever, but could never again be said to truly live. The Citan, now housed in powerful physical forms and backed by an army of undying warriors, turned the tide of the war against the Old Ones decisively. The new Necrons were something the galaxy had never seen before. They did not tire. They did not fear. They could not be demoralized or broken by attrition, because there was no psychological state remaining in them that was vulnerable to such things. They were soulless in the most precise and literal sense of the word, and the Citan drove them forward like weapons, patient, relentless, inexorable weapons that ground through the Old Ones' defenses world by world, stronghold by stronghold. The Old Ones, for all their vast age and wisdom, began to lose. This is where the Old Ones made the mistake that would eventually doom them. Not a mistake born of malice, and not even really a mistake born of stupidity. It was a mistake born of desperation, of a civilization that had been the unchallenged masters of the galaxy for so long that the idea of actually losing was incomprehensible, and so the measures they reached for were disproportionate, rushed, and insufficiently considered. The Citan were vulnerable to psychic energy. This was their one genuine weakness. Beings without souls, without any connection to the Imperium, could be burned and disrupted by concentrated psychic force in a way that no material weapon could replicate. The Old Ones knew this, and so their solution to the Citan problem was characteristically direct. If psychic power could hurt the Citan, then they would create more psychic power, more than had ever existed in the galaxy before, more than the warp had ever been asked to accommodate. They began creating species, new races, engineered from scratch or accelerated from existing organisms, specifically designed to have the deepest possible connection to the warp, the most powerful psychic capabilities that biological beings could carry. And the Aeldari were among the first and most significant of these creations. A species of extraordinary grace and devastating psychic capability, designed to be living weapons against the soulless Necrons and their Catan masters. The Krork were created too, huge and brutally physical, woven together with a bizarre communal psychic field that would allow them to function as a military force without central command. The Jokero, the Canib, the Rashan, species after species was hastily assembled and sent into the war. For a time, this worked. The psychic young races, the Aeldari especially, were devastatingly effective against the Catan. Their ability to manipulate the warp as a weapon disrupted the star gods in ways that Necron Gauss weapons and Catan energy blasts could not. The tide of the war began to turn again, at this time against the Citan and their Necron servants. Victory began to seem, if not certain, then at least possible. But the Old Ones had made a fundamental error, an error that would cost them everything. They had flooded the galaxy with psychic beings in the middle of an already cataclysmic war, and they had not fully reckoned with what all of that psychic energy would do to the warp. Part 3. The Warp Bleeds. Birth of the Enslavers. The warp is, at its most fundamental level, a dimension that reflects consciousness. It is a sea made not of water, but of thought and emotion, a dimension that responds to the inner lives of the beings that exist alongside it in the material universe. In the relatively peaceful era before the war in heaven, the warp's reflective quality was mostly benign. It was deep and vast and occasionally strange, but not inherently predatory. The psychic entities that had always existed within it were old and alien, but not overwhelmingly aggressive. What the war in heaven did to the warp was something that no single mind, not even the Old Ones at their most patient and far-sighted, had fully anticipated. Because when you have billions upon billions of sentient beings dying in battle across a galaxy-spanning conflict, when you have entire civilizations being consumed by the Citan, when you have desperate fear and endless suffering, and the screaming anguish of species being driven toward extinction, all of that experience gets reflected in the warp. It soaks into the Imperium the way blood soaks into sand. Deeply, completely, permanently. The warp began to change. It darkened. It became turbulent in ways it had never been before. with currents of violent psychic energy swirling through it in response to the carnage being perpetrated in the material universe. The entities that had always lived within it responded to this new feast of powerful emotion and began to grow, to change, to become something more dangerous and more predatory than they had been. The warp's gentle reflective surface cracked, and what grew in the cracks was hungry. And then the old ones, in their desperation, added the young races to this already destabilized environment. Suddenly, the warp was not just absorbing the death screams of billions of casualties in a galactic war. It was being hammered with the psychic output of entire species, specifically engineered to radiate warp energy as powerfully as possible. The Eldari alone, a young and untrained in the careful disciplines that would later develop among their kind, were broadcasting enough psychic energy into the Imperium to shake its foundations. And there were other species too, each adding their own contribution to this vast psychic storm that was building in the space behind reality. The peaceful Imperium, the mirror sea that the old ones had navigated safely for millions of years, was being torn apart from within by forces it had never been designed to contain. From this catastrophe, the Enslavers emerged. The precise mechanism of their origin is one of the things that makes them genuinely difficult to categorize, even for the most learned scholars of the 41st millennium. The Inquisition cannot fully agree on what the Enslavers actually are, whether they are predatory creatures that always existed in the warp and were simply amplified and empowered by the chaos of the war in heaven, or whether they were somehow created or called into being by the psychic disruption of that era, or whether they represent something even stranger than either of those possibilities. What is known, and what the records agree on, is that they are absolutely older than chaos as it exists in the 41st millennium. The four chaos gods, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slaanesh, did not yet exist in the era when the Enslavers first began their work. The warp's chaos was primal and formless in those days, not yet organized around divine intelligences. The Enslavers predate the gods. They came from the raw, an untamed chaos of the psychic dimensions collapse into something hostile and dangerous, and they were driven by instincts more fundamental than any religious ideology or divine agenda. They were driven by hunger, by the need to breach the barrier between their dimension and the material universe, to establish themselves in real space, to feed and expand and fill the silence of the galaxy with their presence. And they found, with extraordinary efficiency, the perfect tool for doing all of this. Psychers. Part 4. Anatomy of a Horror. What are the Enslavers? Before we go deeper into what they did, before we follow the full arc of the catastrophe they unleashed, it's worth pausing to sit with what the Enslavers actually are, what they look like, how they exist. Because one of the most unsettling things about them is that they are genuinely strange in a way that makes them hard to fit into any comfortable category of threat. The first thing to understand is that the Enslavers exist in two states, or perhaps two contexts, and what they are in one is quite different from what they are in the other. In the warp, in their native dimension, the true form of the Enslavers is simply unknown. No account has ever captured what they look like within the Imperium itself. The psychic dimension warps and reshapes things that exist within it in ways that make objective description almost meaningless. And whatever the Enslavers are, when they are drifting through the currents of the Imperium, they have never communicated that aspect of themselves to any mortal intelligence. As they arrive in the material universe already in a physical form, already wearing the body that real space observation has recorded. Whatever they are in the warp remains theirs alone. What they appear as in the material universe, once they have successfully manifested through a living warp portal, is something that occupies an unsettling space between familiar and completely alien. Imagine a body roughly 2 meters tall, barrel-shaped or spheroid in its overall silhouette, with a skin that is almost completely transparent in its resting state, allowing you to see something of the internal structure pulsing and moving within. The Old One's students in the field of xenobiology, had any survived long enough to study these creatures academically, would probably have reached for comparisons to terrestrial oceanic life, to the jellyfish and the cephalopods, creatures that are beautiful in their alien logic and deeply unsettling in ways that are difficult to articulate precisely. At the top of the body sits a single large sensory organ, described variously as red, pink, or orange, something that looks like an eye but functions in ways that no one has been able to fully determine. Around the upper portion of the body hangs a cluster of between 8 and 12 tentacles, most of them roughly 1.5 meters long, trailing and writhing with an independence that suggests they have some degree of autonomous responsiveness. 2 of these tentacles are notably longer than the others and end in suckered pads, which serve as the primary manipulative organs, the closest thing the enslaver has to hands, and able to grip and hold and interact with physical objects when needed. They float. They don't walk, have no legs, and cannot technically fly in the traditional sense of sustained directed flight. But they hover, drifting up to 3 meters above the ground, and they are capable of movement that is surprisingly rapid when they choose to employ it. The tentacles assist in rapid directional changes, allowing them to pivot and accelerate in ways that walking would never permit. They can also climb, threading their tentacles around surfaces and pulling themselves along. Their skin can change color at will, though leathery brown appears to be their default in real space. Whether this capacity for color change serves camouflage purposes or some form of communication between enslavers is not known. Yet given that they are never observed communicating with other species in any way, the idea that their coloration serves as an intra-species language of some kind is one of the more interesting speculative possibilities that scholars have entertained. Here is perhaps the most philosophically troubling question about the enslavers. Are they intelligent? The answer, frustratingly and genuinely, is that no one knows. This uncertainty is not born of insufficient study. It is born of the specific nature of the evidence available. The enslavers clearly act with purpose. They demonstrate the ability to coordinate with others of their kind in ways that suggest shared planning. They make what appear to be rational decisions, adjusting their approach based on circumstances, as choosing targets that maximize their expansion rather than simply attacking whatever is closest. They are not mindless. Whatever process drives their behavior has the functional characteristics of intelligence, but they have never communicated with any other species, ever. In all of galactic history, spanning tens of millions of years, from the war in heaven to the 41st millennium, no enslaver has ever made an attempt to exchange information with a non-enslaver entity. They have never used tools. They have never been observed using technology of any kind. All of the physical labor involved in their activities is performed by the slaves they create. Their psychically dominated thralls do the construction work, the combat, the routine maintenance of their expanding domain. The enslaver itself simply exists, exerts its will, and directs. All this could mean that enslavers are intelligent, but simply have absolutely no interest in or need for communication with lesser beings. The silence might be the silence of contempt. Why would you speak to an organism you regard as nothing more than raw material? This interpretation would make the enslavers genuinely terrifying in a specific way. Not monsters that cannot think, but minds so alien and so assured of their own dominance that the concept of diplomacy or communication simply does not register as relevant. Alternatively, the silence might indicate something weirder. Perhaps what looks like group intelligence and coordinated behavior in enslavers is not individual sapience, but something more like a collective biological drive, complex and effective, capable of responding adaptively to circumstances, but not truly self-aware in any sense we would recognize. Like how a slime mold exhibits surprisingly sophisticated behavior in navigating a maze without having any neurons at all. Perhaps the enslaver is doing something functionally similar, operating on psychic instincts so deep and so refined that they produce intelligent-looking results from a non-thinking substrate. The Inquisition's Ordo Xenos, the division of the Inquisition specifically tasked with studying and combating alien threats, and the Ordo Malleus, which handles warp-born entities and demonic incursions. Both have active interests in the Enslavers, which itself speaks to the ambiguity of their nature. They fall so perfectly between categories that two separate organizations claim jurisdiction over them simultaneously. Are they Xenos? Yes. Most clearly, they are alien beings, not native to the material universe and not products of any human culture. Are they warp entities? Also yes. They originate in the Imperium. They exist partially in warp space. They interact with reality through psychic mechanisms that share more with demonic possession than with conventional alien threat. The Enslavers are both and neither, and this categorical slipperiness is genuinely part of what makes them dangerous. No existing protocol was perfectly designed to counter them, because no one designed protocols with the assumption that such a thing was possible. One final aspect of the Enslavers' nature before we move on to what they do with it. At their relationship to chaos, to the entities and powers that dominate the warp in the 41st millennium, is characterized by a kind of mutual indifference that has interesting implications. The Enslavers do not serve the Chaos Gods. They predate the Chaos Gods. They were here before Khorne's first rage or Nurgle's first plague, before Tzeentch began scheming or Slaanesh was even a possibility. The ruinous powers acknowledge their existence, but appear to regard them as they might regard a weather pattern, a force of nature operating on its own logic, neither an ally nor an enemy in any conventional sense, simply something that is. Crucially, and this is important from a strategic perspective, the Enslavers are also distinctly different from demons in another significant way. They don't work for anyone. A chaos demon, however terrifying, is ultimately the expression of a chaos god's will or a manifestation of the warp's concentrated emotion. It can, in theory, be bargained with, redirected, dismissed through proper ritual. The chaos gods themselves have agendas, personalities, desires that can be understood and occasionally exploited. Tzeentch schemes. Nurgle offers gifts. Even Khorne has an ethos, a code of sorts. These things are comprehensible in a way that makes them, paradoxically, slightly less terrifying than something that has no agenda whatsoever, except the mechanics of its own propagation. This means the Enslavers offer none of the conventional vulnerabilities that chaos entities do. They cannot be banished through faith. They cannot be repelled through holy symbols or prayers to the Emperor. They respond to the tools of the Ordo Malleus only in the limited sense that physical weapons work on their material bodies. Their psychic essence is not structured in the way that demonic entities are structured, and the wards and bindings that keep daemons at bay are largely irrelevant to an enslaver. The Sisters of Battle's faith-powered resistance to warp corruption does nothing specifically against them. The Grey Knight's psychic wards are tuned to the frequencies of chaos, not to the alien and older psychic signature of the Enslavers. In a galaxy where the Imperium has spent 10,000 years developing tools specifically designed to protect against chaos, the Enslavers represent a threat that those tools cannot adequately address. New approaches are required, and new approaches. In an Imperium that struggles to maintain even the technology it inherited, are not easily developed. The question of whether Enslavers are even capable of being killed is another source of inquisitorial debate. Their physical forms in the material universe are real and solid enough that conventional weapons affect them. They can be shot, cut, destroyed through sufficient force. But this represents only the material expression of the enslaver. What happens to the entity within the warp when its material form is destroyed is unclear. Does the enslaver die truly and permanently, or does it simply withdraw to the immaterium, to drift and wait, and eventually find another opening? The ossified husk that Trazyn the Infinite keeps in his collection suggests that at least some enslavers can die in a permanent and physical sense. But whether the destruction of the material body constitutes the death of the consciousness, or merely the expulsion of it back to the warp, is a question that the Inquisition has not been able to answer definitively. This uncertainty has obvious operational implications. Killing an enslaver might be a permanent solution or a temporary delay, and the difference matters enormously.
Okay, I want to say about narrator mode for just a second because I genuinely think about this one a lot. What gets me about the enslavers more than any other threat in this entire setting is that they're not a punishment, they're not karma, they're not some dark god deciding to make an example of someone. They're just the consequence of the galaxy becoming something. Like, the universe didn't choose to do this to the old ones. The old ones just became something the universe produces in response to. That distinction is so deeply unsettling to me because it means there's no one to negotiate with, no agenda to understand, and no mercy to appeal to. You crossed a threshold. The threshold has a consequence, and that's it. And when I look at the 41st millennium, at the psychic awakening, the Great Rift, and at the growing population of unsanctioned psychers, I genuinely think the Enslavers might be the most underrated existential threat in the entire game. Not because they're secretly the strongest, but because they're the most quiet. They don't announce themselves. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
When planning a response to an incursion. Part 5. The mechanism of infection. How they hunt and possess. Now we come to the part of the enslaver lore that I find genuinely haunting. Not the history of how they destroyed civilizations, not the abstract numbers of galactic casualties. Those are large enough to feel almost unreal. What haunts me is the mechanism, the specific, documented, our step-by-step process by which an enslaver finds a victim and begins the process of tearing them apart from the inside out. It begins with detection. Somewhere in the warp, an enslaver is drifting. It has no material form yet. It is navigating the currents of the Imperium, the way a fish navigates the currents of the deep ocean, with instincts refined over millions of years into something precise and automatic. And somewhere ahead of it, bleeding through the thin boundary between the warp and the material universe, there is a light, not a visual light, something that the human mind reaches for analogies to describe because there's no precise word for it. A psychic radiance, the emanation of a consciousness that touches the warp, the kind of signal that every psyker broadcasts into the Imperium simply by existing. Enslavers can detect this signal from a range that the lore states may be up to 10 light years. Think about that distance for a moment. 10 light years is a vast span of space by any practical human measure. There are only a handful of other star systems within 10 light years of Earth. And an enslaver, drifting in the warp, can sense an unshielded psyker's presence from across that entire volume of space, the way a predator in deep water can sense the chemical trace of blood from an enormous distance through a medium specifically designed to carry such signals. The stronger and more unprotected the psyker, the more powerfully they broadcast. An untrained, unsanctioned psyker with raw and uncontrolled abilities blazes in the warp like a bonfire compared to the carefully managed ember of a fully trained and sanctioned astropath. The Imperium's entire system of psyker registration, the black ships, the soul binding, the rigorous training, all of this exists partly for exactly this reason, to dampen the psychic signal that psykers radiate into the warp, to make them harder to notice, to reduce the invitation they broadcast to whatever might be listening. When an enslaver detects a suitable psyker, it does not act alone. 3 enslavers typically converge on the target together, drawn by the same signal, forming what the lore describes as a mental bond among themselves, a cooperative arrangement specifically for the purpose of what comes next. This grouping of 3 is not an accident or coincidence. It seems to be the optimal configuration for the process they intend to carry out. A kind of distributed psychic effort that 3 entities working in concert can achieve more efficiently than one. Now begins the possession. And unlike the possession of demons, which tends to be violent, dramatic, visually obvious, the kind of thing that immediately alerts everyone around the victim that something has gone terribly wrong, the enslaver's possession is specifically designed to be invisible. The victim doesn't know it's happening. The 3 enslavers form a parasitic psychic bond with their chosen target. And the changes this bond induces begin gradually, subtly, the kind of changes that could easily be explained away as stress or illness or bad sleep. The victim becomes lethargic. They grow tired in ways that rest doesn't fix. Their skin begins to discolor, it taking on a strange and unhealthy pallor that might be mistaken for any number of mundane ailments. They go about their daily life, interacting with colleagues, eating their meals, performing their duties, while inside their skull, very quietly, something is happening to them that cannot be undone. The enslaver-possessed psyche, in this early phase, does not act erratically in any obvious way. The possession works differently from demonic control, which tends to twist the victim toward obvious corruption and increasingly bizarre behavior. An enslaver-controlled psyche, instead, simply does what the enslavers direct them to do. And what the enslavers direct them to do, in this initial phase, is continue functioning normally, while gradually, subconsciously, working to find other psyches. The victim is turned into a scout, a lure, a means of drawing more potential hosts into proximity so that the process can be repeated. This is the moment the law refers to as a window of opportunity, and it is a chillingly brief one. Sanctioned psychers, those who have been trained and bound through the Imperium's processes, have somewhat more resistance to the initial possession due to the preparation their minds have undergone. If they become aware of what is happening to them, if they feel the alien touch and recognize it for what it is, and if those around them can mount a physical attack on the enslaver or its agents quickly enough, there is a chance, slim but real, that the invasion can be stopped. This is why the Inquisition's protocols for dealing with enslaver incursions emphasize speed above almost everything else. Every hour that passes between infection and response narrows the window. If the window is not taken, the process enters its final and irreversible phase. Between 50 and 75 hours after the initial bond is established, roughly 2 to 3 days, the transformation accelerates dramatically. The victim's body begins to change in ways that can no longer be hidden or dismissed as ordinary illness. The flesh swells. Tissue begins to break down and reconstitute itself according to a logic that has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with dimensional mechanics. The body is being rewired at a fundamental level, the organic machinery of a human being repurposed into something that nature never intended. What emerges at the end of this process is no longer a person, but what was once a human psyche has become a living warp gate. A pulsating arch of ruptured, reshaped flesh, a portal between dimensions that is simultaneously organic and spatial, a doorway made from what was once a thinking, feeling individual. Through this gate, the three enslavers that created it pass into the material universe, fully manifested, solid and physical and hungry. And then, they begin looking for the next psychers. This is the exponential horror of the enslaver plague, the feature that earns it the name plague rather than attack or invasion. Because each set of 3 enslavers that comes through a gate immediately sets about finding new psychers to repeat the process. 3 become 9, 9 become 27, 27 become 81. Then each new enslaver that enters the material universe accelerates the creation of new gates. And each new gate accelerates the arrival of more enslavers. The expansion is not linear. It is geometric, doubling and redoubling in a cascade that has a mathematical inevitability to it once it gets past a certain threshold. On a world with a small number of psychers, particularly if those psychers are well trained and well protected, the process might be slow enough that the Inquisition's rapid response protocols can intervene and cut it off. But on a world with a large population of unsanctioned psychers, particularly if the planetary government has been lax about the psycher tithe, or if an unsanctioned one has been deliberately hidden from the black ships, the cascade can reach critical mass frighteningly fast. There is a particular cruelty in the way that the enslaved thralls are deployed once the enslavers have established themselves. The dominated population doesn't become aggressive automatons in an obvious horror movie way. They continue to look like themselves. They continue to speak and move with the physical mannerisms of the people they were, the person you knew, the neighbor you've shared a war with for 20 years, the colleague you've eaten lunch with 1,000 times. They are still using that face, still wearing those clothes, still calling you by your name. The intelligence behind their eyes is simply no longer theirs. What looks back at you from behind that familiar face is the enslaver's will, expressed through the meat puppet architecture of a person you cared about. And it will use every piece of information it gleaned from that person's memories, every relationship, every secret, every routine, to get close enough to you to make you the next host. This is not a theoretical horror. The account of Hive Scorpios describes how quickly this process escalated from a single compromised psyker to continental-scale conflict, and the mechanism described is exactly this. Enslaved individuals who looked normal, who functioned normally, who went to work and came home and talked to their families and their friends, while the enslavers worked through them to identify and locate the next psykers. 3 days from first contact to full hive city collapse. Not because the enslavers are physically overwhelming. The physical forms that emerge through the portals are roughly man-sized, powerful but not superhuman. But the speed of the collapse came from the silent, invisible army of thralls, each one a trusted and familiar face carrying an alien agenda. The lore contains a quote that I keep returning to every time I think about this subject. It belongs to Inquisitor Mallan of the Ordo Xenos, and it is recorded as part of a briefing about what happened on that world. Just one witch, unsanctioned, caused the destruction of Hive Scorpios when one of those things used her brain as a gateway to this world. Within 3 days, the entire Hive's population was reduced to drooling mind slaves. Within 3 weeks, an entire continent was at war. And all because the governor thought his family should be exempt from the psyker cull and refused to give his daughter to the black ships. 3 days. The entire population of a hive city. One psyker, or one family's selfishness and pride. Read those numbers again and sit with them for a moment. A hive city in the Warhammer 40,000 setting contains populations ranging from hundreds of millions to several billion people. 3 days. One unsanctioned psyker who was hidden from the black ships because her father was a governor, and governors sometimes forget that the rules which keep everyone alive apply to them too. The entire architecture of the Imperium's psyker management system, the tithe, the black ships, the sanctioning process, the soul binding, all of it, exists specifically to prevent this exact sequence of events from unfolding. And when one person decided their child was too important to be part of that system, billions of people died or were enslaved in 72 hours. The enslaver, once present in sufficient numbers on a world, as graduates from seeking psykers to seeking everyone. Because here is the additional capability that distinguishes these things from almost any other warp-born threat. Unlike demons, enslavers can directly psychically enslave non-psykers too. Ordinary people, with no warp connection whatsoever, are not immune. The enslavers simply have to accumulate enough of themselves, or an individual of sufficient power, and they can extend their mental dominion to anyone within a range of roughly 50 meters. The enslaved non-psyker retains all their physical capabilities, all their knowledge and strength, but every scrap of autonomous will is gone. They are controlled fully and without hesitation, directed even toward their own destruction if the enslaver so desires. A single enslaver of ordinary power can directly dominate up to 10 non-psyker individuals simultaneously within that 50-meter radius. With more of them coordinating, with enough psychic mass in one place, they can scale this domination dramatically. Up to and including the population of an entire hive city, billions of people reduced to an army of thralls, their minds quietly consumed and their bodies repurposed as the instruments of their new masters. Consider what a planet in the grip of an advanced enslaver infestation actually looks like. Not the chaotic, bloody ruin of a world attacked by orcs, or the plague-rotted landscape of a Nurgle-touched world. In the early stages, at least, it might look almost normal. The factories still run, because the enslaved workers still show up and operate the machinery. The roads still carry traffic. The lights still come on in the morning. The enslavers have no particular interest in destroying infrastructure. They need the infrastructure to process more potential hosts efficiently. The horror is in the faces of the people you pass on the street, in the silence where there should be laughter and argument, and the ordinary noise of human life, in the way that everyone moves with the same slightly too smooth coordination. The way that eyes that should reflect individual personality instead reflect a singular alien purpose, looking out from behind 1,000 different faces. And then the portals start opening faster, and the faces start changing, one by one, as the psychers are found and used, and the gate between the warp and reality grows wider and more permanent, and the point of no return passes, as somewhere at some moment that no one can precisely identify, after which the only acceptable plan of action is exterminatus, the complete and total annihilation of the world from orbit. Every living thing on the surface burned away. Because a world under full enslaver control is not a world with people on it anymore. It is a staging ground, a workshop for manufacturing more portals. Every hour it is permitted to continue functioning as such, the enslavers spread a little further. The calculus is horrifying. The Inquisition knows this. The decision to issue a writ of exterminatus on a world is not one anyone takes lightly. It means the deaths of everyone on that world, enslaved and free. Billions of lives ended in the time it takes an orbital bombardment to reach the surface. But the alternative, in a confirmed full enslaver infestation, is potentially worse. The precedent exists. The last time the enslavers were permitted to run without containment, the entire galaxy went silent. Part 6. The Enslaver Plague. Galactic Extinction. Event return now to 60 million years ago. Return to the war in heaven, at the moment when the Old One's desperate strategy of creating psychic races to counter the Satan had just begun to show results. The Aeldari are fighting. The Krork are smashing through Necron lines. The Satan are being disrupted by the concentrated psychic assaults of beings specifically designed for this purpose. Victory, real, actual, final victory over the Necrons and their star god masters, is beginning to seem attainable. And then the warp opens up and everything comes undone. The Enslavers, was drawn by the vast psychic output of the Old One's newly created warrior races, begin breaching the material universe in numbers that no one had anticipated and no one had prepared for. The Old Ones, who had carefully navigated the warp for millions of years, find that the Imperium they had relied on is no longer the place they knew. Something has changed in it, something fundamental. And from that changed, destabilized dimension, from the cracks that the war in heaven had opened in the boundary between the warp and reality, these creatures come flooding through. They come first through the Psychers, the Old One's freshly created warrior races, brimming with warp energy, and often without the deep psychic discipline that only centuries of careful training can develop, are precisely the ideal population of hosts. The Aeldari are particularly vulnerable in this era. They were created to be psychically powerful, not psychically disciplined, and a species that was only just beginning to develop the cultural frameworks for managing its own abilities responsibly, was broadcasting warp signals so powerful that it probably lit up the Imperium like a supernova. The enslavers converged on them with the focused efficiency of a predator that has found an unlimited food source. World by world, the Old One's strongholds began to fall. Not to the Necrons, not to the Citan, to the Enslavers. The creatures they had created to be their weapons were becoming gateways, living portals from which more enslavers poured through in an ever-accelerating cascade. As the Old One's psychic guardians, the warp-sensitive beings they had relied upon to defend their territories, were enslaved and turned against them. Their servant races went first, then their outer defenses, then the strongholds themselves. The Old Ones were trapped between two advancing catastrophes, the Necrons still pressing their offensive from outside, and the enslaver plague consuming their forces from within. The Satan themselves recognized what was happening and made a cold and pragmatic calculation. Let the enslavers do their work, retreat to safety, wait out the plague. The star gods pulled their Necron forces back rather than advancing into a galaxy that was eating itself. Even the Satan, with all their power and appetite, were wise enough to stay back from the enslavers' expanding reach. In desperation, the Old Ones tried to create more new species to fight the enslavers directly. Among their last creations were the Krork, the direct ancestors of what would eventually become the Orcs, hard, barely psychic, and resistant to the enslavers' possession mechanisms. And the Jokairo, strange creatures with an almost supernatural ability to understand and work with technology. These creations came too late to change the outcome. The flood was already past the point where any fresh defense could contain it. The Old Ones' civilization did not die in a single dramatic final battle. It collapsed. Stronghold by stronghold, world by world, the network of webway gates that connected their empire began to fail. Some because the Old Ones themselves destroyed them, us deliberately sealing portals to prevent the enslavers from using the webway as a highway for their expansion, cutting off their own retreat routes in the process. Others because the worlds those gates connected to were no longer safe, no longer populated by Old Ones, but by their enslaved former servants, shambling in service to the alien intelligences that had hollowed them out. By the end, the Old Ones were scattered, driven from world after world, their great civilization in ruins. Whether the last of them died in hiding, cornered in some forgotten corner of the galaxy by the enslavers' inexorable spread, or whether a remnant managed to flee through the webway to somewhere beyond the galaxy's edge, this is not known. Yet the law marks their fate as extinction or flight, and the honest answer is that no one has been able to determine which it was. The Old Ones simply stopped being present. The garden they had cultivated for millions of years was abandoned. The species they had created were left to fend for themselves in a galaxy being devoured. The enslavers, now without organized resistance, spread across the remaining life-bearing worlds with a systematic efficiency that consumed most of what was left. The galaxy, which had spent millions of years slowly filling with the diverse civilizations that the Old Ones had seeded and encouraged, began to go quiet. The lights were going out, one by one, world by world, as the geometric expansion of the plague reached critical mass across star system after star system. As for a period that is difficult to measure precisely, the records of this era are fragmentary almost to the point of non-existence. The Milky Way was a wasteland. The great network of life that the Old Ones had spent eons building was dismantled. The diverse collection of young civilizations that had been developing under the Old Ones' care were, for the most part, consumed. Intelligent life in the galaxy was reduced from rich abundance to near nothing. Pockets of survivors hidden in places the enslavers hadn't yet reached, or protected by some quality that made them less attractive targets, or simply lucky. The Eldari survived. This is genuinely remarkable given their psychic profile. The very qualities that should have made them the perfect victims somehow weren't sufficient to completely destroy them. And the likely explanation involves the Eldari developing, in the white heat of existential crisis, the beginnings of the psychic discipline that would later become central to their culture. Facing extinction by a predator that hunted them specifically through their psychic output, those Eldari who survived were those who learned to control and contain that output, who developed the mental fortitude to resist the gentle, insinuating pressure of the enslaver's initial bond. The enslavers do have a somewhat harder time with disciplined minds, and the Eldari, under pressure so extreme that it constituted an evolutionary filter, may have developed just enough collective psychic discipline to pull through. They also had access to the webway. The Old Ones' tunnels through the Imperium may have provided refuge for Ealdari, who could navigate them, safe passage through the one dimension the enslavers could not follow, at least in the same numbers. The Krork also survived in scattered pockets, their minimal psychic profile making them less appealing targets. These remnants would eventually, over tens of millions of years, degenerate into the species that the 41st millennium knows as orcs, still brutish, still inexhaustible, still carrying within their biology the extraordinary design principles the old ones built into them, but without the organized purpose or direction that the Krork had possessed. The humans, the small, primate-like ancestors of humanity that the old ones had been seeding on distant Terra, were so far below the threshold of psychic development that they were essentially invisible to the enslavers. Without a significant psychic presence to broadcast in the warp, they weren't worth pursuing. They survived by default, unremarkable and unnoticed on their unremarkable planet, generations passing in ignorance of the apocalypse unfolding across the rest of the galaxy. Eventually, the plague burned itself out, not because anything stopped it, not because any force or strategy defeated it, but because it consumed its own food source. The enslavers fed on psychers and enslaved non-psychers, and when they had exhausted the available supply on a world, that world fell silent, and they moved on, world by world, but they stripped the galaxy of the concentrated psychic civilizations that had been their feast. And as the food ran out, the plague couldn't sustain itself at the density it had achieved. The numbers dropped. The cascade slowed. Without enough psychic hosts to maintain the portal creation cycle, individual enslavers found themselves stranded in a material universe that was, for the first time in their experience, largely empty. They drifted back into the warp, or they simply ceased, their physical forms dissolving as the dimensional tether that kept them in real space was no longer being maintained by sufficient numbers of active portals. The plague ended, not with a battle, but with a silence, the silence of a feast that had consumed everything worth consuming and left the table bare. What the galaxy that emerged from the other side of the enslaver plague was almost unrecognizable from the one that had preceded it. Where there had been millions of years of accumulated civilization, there was nothing. Ruins on uninhabited worlds. The residual traces of the webway, mostly inaccessible now without the old ones to maintain it. A few scattered surviving populations of the young races, traumatized and without guidance, beginning the long, slow work of rebuilding. Part 7. The Domino Effect. Necrons, Citan, and the Great Sleep. The enslavers did not just destroy the old ones. The consequences of the plague cascaded outward through every faction that had been involved in the war in heaven, reshaping the politics and military situation of the galaxy in ways that would define its history for the next 60 million years. The Citan had retreated from the enslaver plague with what passed for wisdom in beings of their nature. They had seen that their food supply was being systematically consumed by an uncontrollable force, and had pulled back rather than risk their newly embodied physical forms. But this retreat put them in an unexpected position. With the old ones gone, with the young races mostly destroyed or scattered, the galaxy was no longer a feeding ground. There was almost nothing left to eat. And the Necrons were still there, still undying, still bound to service, but now in a galaxy that their masters could not feed in, guarding Citan who were weakened and who, without ready sustenance, were beginning to turn on each other in their hunger. The Citan consumed each other. Whether this was planned or merely the inevitable consequence of beings driven by insatiable hunger, finding no other food source, the outcome was a series of conflicts among the star gods themselves, each consuming or damaging the others in pursuit of the energy they needed to sustain themselves. The great Citan, who had been so fearsome at the height of the war in heaven, were weakened dramatically by these internal conflicts. And the Necrons, watching all of this, executed a plan that their most powerful ruler, Sarek, the Silent King, had apparently been developing and waiting for the right moment to deploy for a very long time. Armed with weapons specifically designed for the purpose, the Necrons turned on the Satan. The star gods, weakened by their infighting and caught off guard by the betrayal of the beings they had considered tools, were overwhelmed and shattered, their vast, unified consciousnesses broken into innumerable fragments, each too small and too diminished to threaten their former servants. These fragments were contained in technological prisons called tesseract labyrinths, sealed away as living weapons the Necrons could deploy, while ensuring that their former masters could never again dominate them. The Necrons had achieved something remarkable. They had destroyed their gods and taken their power, secured their own freedom from divine domination, and emerged as perhaps the most militarily potent force remaining in the galaxy. By rights, this should have been the dawn of a new Necron golden age. They had won the war in heaven. Yet they had overthrown their Satan masters. The galaxy lay before them, emptied by the enslaver plague of most of the civilizations that might have contested their dominance. But winning had cost them enormously. The Necron dynasties, already diminished by the endless battles of the war in heaven, had been further reduced by the campaign against the Satan. They were stretched thin, their numbers a fraction of what they had once been. And the Aeldari, the survivors of the enslaver plague, the psychic warrior species that the old ones had created, were clearly recovering, growing, beginning to assert themselves as the dominant power in the post-plague galaxy. The Aeldari still despised the Necrons for what they had done during the war, still burned with the accumulated grief of watching their civilization nearly destroyed. And the Aeldari, at full strength, were a psychic force that the weakened Necron dynasties could not reliably defeat. Zarek made his final great strategic decision. He ordered the Great Sleep. The Necrons would not attempt to hold or rebuild immediately. They would retreat to pre-prepared tomb worlds, planets carefully stripped of all life to deny the enslavers any potential hosts, maintained by automated constructs and machine servants, and enter stasis. They would sleep for as long as it took for the Aeldari's moment to pass, for the galaxy to evolve new life forms that would be less capable of resistance, for circumstances to shift in their favor. Their immortal bodies would endure the sleep without degradation. In 20 million years, in 30, in 60, they would wake to a galaxy ripe for conquest. And their old conflicts dust, and their rivals long since fallen. This decision explains one of the most fundamental mysteries of the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy. Why the Necrons, who by rights should be the most powerful military force in existence, have been absent from galactic history for so long. They weren't destroyed. They weren't defeated. They went to sleep by choice, because a being that has achieved true immortality can afford to wait in ways that no mortal civilization can. The Silent King himself chose not to join his people in their sleep. Having destroyed the mechanisms by which he had controlled the Necron legions, releasing them from his authority rather than maintaining a chain of command over sleeping bodies, he left the galaxy entirely, spending millions of years alone in the void between galaxies, wrestling with whatever passed for regret in the mind of the being responsible for the Necrontier's bargain with the Satan, and the galaxy that remained, emptied by war and plague and the Necrons' withdrawal, began the slow work of recovery, of evolution, of new civilizations rising from the scattered survivors of the old ones, and from the worlds where basic life had persisted through everything. Part 8. The Modern-Day Threat. Enslavers in the 41st Millennium. The enslaver plague ended. The galaxy recovered. Over tens of millions of years, new civilizations rose and fell. The Aeldari grew to galactic dominance, then collapsed into decadence, then fell catastrophically with the birth of Slanesh. Humanity rose from primitive origins to a scattered, troubled interstellar species, then collapsed during the Age of Strife, then was reunited by the Emperor. The 41st Millennium arrived, and with it, a galaxy full of war and suffering and horror of every possible kind. And the enslavers are still here. This is the thing that is so easy to forget when you're focused on the big, loud threats of the 41st Millennium. The Tyrannid hive fleets, the Chaos forces, the Necron dynasties awakening one by one. The enslavers didn't go extinct when the plague burned itself out 60 million years ago. They are still in the warp, still drifting, still following the psychic signals that intelligent life broadcasts. The galaxy recovered and filled itself with new life, and with that new life came new psychers, new signals, new invitations. The feast is available again. What Inquisitor Malin's account of the Hive Scorpios incident is the clearest modern example of how quickly and devastatingly an enslaver incursion can unfold in the 41st millennium's context. One psyker, 3 days, an entire hive city, 3 weeks, an entire continent. The mechanics have not changed. The scale of destruction is exactly what it was 60 million years ago. It's just contained by the Imperium's protocols, most of the time, when those protocols are actually followed. The key phrase is, most of the time. In the year 260.993 of the 41st millennium, counting years from the founding of the Imperium, Inquisition forces in the Scintilla system, the capital of the Calixis sector, encountered multiple enslavers and destroyed them. The investigation that followed revealed something deeply alarming. The enslavers had been embedded within a criminal smuggling network that dealt in rogue psychers. The Fax Ligni, the most powerful criminal organization in the Calixis sector, had apparently been moving unsanctioned psychers for profit, without any awareness, or perhaps without adequate concern, that they were creating precisely the conditions an enslaver infestation requires. Unregistered, untrained psychers being moved across the sector in large numbers, their psychic emanations broadcasting through the warp without any of the protective training or soul-binding that might have muffled them. The Inquisition shut it down, this time. But the Calixis sector is one of hundreds of Imperial sectors, and criminal networks dealing in unsanctioned psychers are not exactly a rarity in the 41st millennium's underbelly. The enslavers needed only one successful breach to begin the cascade. The Inquisition's successful intervention at Scintilla was not a victory so much as a successful piece of triage, one fire extinguished in a galaxy full of potential ignition points. The Jericho Reach, a region of space where the Imperium has been engaged in the Achilles Crusade, a protracted and increasingly costly campaign to reclaim worlds lost to chaos and alien domination, has been identified by Inquisition scholars as a potential vector for an enslaver resurgence. What they call the Dark Pattern, a series of unusual and seemingly unconnected events across the Reach, has the shape of something being set in motion. Whether this is enslaver activity or something else entirely is not confirmed, but the very fact that the Inquisition is monitoring for this possibility speaks to how seriously the threat is taken at the highest levels of Imperial authority. The Nemesis incident, which occurred in roughly the 945th year of the 36th millennium, during the dark and tumultuous period known as the Age of Apostasy, remains the most comprehensively documented modern enslaver incursion. And even the documentation is limited, because one of the first things the Inquisition did after the incident concluded was classify almost everything about it. The Storm Wardens, a chapter of Space Marines operating in the Calixis sector region of the Segmentum Obscurus, were dispatched to the Steropes cluster in response to intelligence about an enslaver infestation. The scale of what they found exceeded anything their briefings had prepared them for. Several worlds had been entirely consumed, their populations enslaved, their surfaces under full enslaver dominion. The warp energies associated with the infestation had created localized storms that warped the reality of surrounding space, and within those storms lay cyclopean ruins of uncertain origin, structures that predated any known civilization in the region, perhaps remnants of the Old One's era, perhaps something else. Chapter Master Owen Glendwire led his forces, including the elite veterans of the First Company, into this nightmare, where 3 worlds were cleansed of the infestation through direct military action, battles against armies of enslaved humans, all the military capability of entire planetary populations, directed by alien minds against the Space Marines, waves of mind-controlled thralls, former soldiers and civilians and workers, fighting with the complete absence of hesitation that enslaver domination produces. Human beings used as weapons against other human beings, the enslaved killing the free on behalf of entities that regarded both as equally irrelevant. And then came the enslaver behemoths. The records don't fully describe what behemoths are, whether they are simply unusually powerful individual enslavers, or some larger variant of the species, or perhaps a more advanced form that develops under certain conditions. What the fragmentary accounts make clear is that they were significantly more dangerous than ordinary enslavers, that they cost the first company dearly, and that whatever else happened in those ancient ruins left a mark on the surviving Space Marines that could not be safely allowed to simply rejoin their chapter. 7 worlds were declared beyond recovery. The Inquisitor Lord, accompanying the Storm Wardens, issued the writ of exterminatus on each of them in turn, burning them clean from orbit. Billions of inhabitants, all enslaved, all lost, all given the Emperor's mercy in the form of planetary-scale annihilation rather than allowing the infestation to continue spreading. When the Storm Wardens returned to their homeworld of Sacris, it became clear that the taint had followed them. The entire First Company, every surviving veteran, of the elite warriors who had fought in the ruins of the Steropes cluster, had been exposed to something. The nature of the contamination is unclear, even from the classified records. Whether it was direct psychic infection by the enslavers, exposure to some residual effect of prolonged proximity to their influence, or something entirely specific to what was found in those ruins. None of this has been confirmed in any accessible document. Chapter Master Glendwy's response was one of the most striking acts of self-sacrifice recorded in Space Marine history. He ordered the entire First Company, himself included, sealed in deep stasis, interred in sarcophagi beneath the fortress monastery on Sacris's moon of High Castle, to remain there until someone could determine a cure for whatever the enslavers had done to them. Yet he effectively removed himself and his finest warriors from the chapter permanently, perhaps forever, on the slim chance that future generations might develop the knowledge to reverse what had been done. The Inquisition demanded, as a condition of permitting this arrangement, that all knowledge of the incident be scrubbed from accessible records. Sacris was declared a forbidden world. Automated warning beacons were placed in orbit around it, broadcasting warnings of virulent plague to drive away any curious visitors. The Storm Wardens rebuilt, recruited new warriors, continued their service. But the chapter never quite lost the shadow of what had happened. The aloof and insular quality that those who study them attribute to the weight of their secret in the deepest vaults of their fortress. Behind barriers guarded by dreadnoughts who stand permanent watch, the original First Company sleeps and waits, and has now been waiting for over 5,000 years. Even Trazyn the Infinite, the eccentric Necron overlord who collects significant historical artifacts in his galleries on the tomb world of Solemnace, keeps an ossified husk of an enslaver among his exhibits. The list of things Trazyn considers worth collecting reads like a summary of the most significant events in galactic history, and the enslaver husk sits alongside the Wraithbone choir of a legendary craft world and the preserved head of a great imperial saint. He apparently checks, personally, every time he enters that particular room, that the thing is actually dead. This detail tells you something. When one of the most powerful and casually confident beings in the galaxy makes a point of personally verifying the death of a museum specimen every single visit, that specimen belongs to a category of threat that even beings who have survived 60 million years treat with extreme caution. Part 9. The Coming Storm, the Great Rift, and the Psychic Awakening. And now we reach the part of this story that should make every Warhammer 40,000 fan sit up a little straighter. At the end of the 41st Millennium, as the traitor legions under the command of Abaddon the Despoiler launched the 13th Black Crusade in full, as the fortress world of Cadia fell for the first time in 10,000 years of continuous war, as the warp storms that had been building around the Eye of Terror finally broke their containment. The galaxy was torn in half. As the Great Rift, the cicatrix maledictum, a wound in reality so massive that it spans the entire galaxy from one edge to the other, opened up and changed everything. This is catastrophic in more ways than the obvious. Yes, it split the Imperium into two halves, cutting off communication and travel across vast sections of the galaxy. Yes, it allowed chaos forces to pour through the breach in unprecedented numbers. Yes, it ended the era of the Astronomican's reliable guidance across half the galaxy, leaving entire sectors of the Imperium nihilus blind and isolated. But there is another consequence of the Great Rift that receives somewhat less attention in the broad strategic assessments. It began an event called the Psychic Awakening. Across the galaxy, in the wake of the Rift's opening, the rates of new psyker emergence surged dramatically. The psychic energy bleeding through the Rift into the material universe seemed to act as a catalyst for latent psychic abilities that had previously remained dormant. People who had shown no psychic potential before suddenly began manifesting powers. Existing psykers found their abilities intensifying, sometimes catastrophically. Even species that had historically shown minimal psychic expression began demonstrating new or enhanced warp connections. The Imperium's black ships, the massive, sinister fleets whose sole purpose is to travel the galaxy, collecting registered psykers before they can cause harm or be exploited by hostile forces, were already stretched beyond their operational capacity before the Rift opened. The surge of new psykers that followed made an already precarious situation genuinely critical. Worlds where black ship visits had fallen behind schedule, worlds cut off from contact with their sector command by the Rift's disruption of interstellar travel, worlds where local governance had decided to exercise the kind of discretion that governors of Hive Scorpio's population had once exercised. These worlds were accumulating unsanctioned psykers faster than any collection effort could keep pace with. There are also the Arcs of Omen to consider, the great vessels of Abaddon, the Despoiler's forces, which have reportedly encountered enslavers in the newer era of conflict following the Great Rift. This suggests that the enslavers are not merely a historical footnote, not something safely confined to the distant past or to isolated incidents in forgotten sectors. They are active, they are probing, yet they are responding to exactly the kind of conditions that 60 million years ago allowed their plague to sweep the galaxy. Consider the perfect storm of factors that are converging in the modern era. The Great Rift has weakened the barrier between the warp and reality across enormous swaths of the galaxy, making the dimensional skin thinner and more permeable in ways that make portal creation substantially easier. The Psychic Awakening has created an unprecedented surge in unsanctioned psykers, each of them broadcasting warp signals without the protective training that might reduce their attractiveness as hosts. The black ships are understaffed and overwhelmed, meaning more unsanctioned psykers are going uncollected for longer. The disruption of interstellar communication makes coordinated Inquisition response to emerging incursions slower and more difficult. And the sheer scale of continuous warfare across the galaxy, the dying of billions, the psychic screaming of countless souls consumed by the Great Rift, continues to destabilize the warp exactly as the war in Heaven's casualties once did. The parallel is not subtle. The Old Ones faced the Enslaver plague at the end of a war that had shattered the warp, when the galaxy was full of newly created psychic beings that the Enslavers could use. The 41st Millennium has a war that is shattering the warp, a galaxy rapidly filling with newly manifest psychic beings, and a Great Rift that has torn open the dimensional boundary that previously kept the Enslavers' approach from the material universe somewhat constrained. The Inquisition knows this. The most informed scholars of the Ordo Xenos have been watching the signs with growing alarm. The quote from Inquisitor Felroth Gelt in his private journals dated to the 781st year of the 41st Millennium captures a sentiment that appears increasingly in classified communications from Inquisitors who have had cause to study this threat. The Ordo Xenos is aware of the horrible means that enslavers use to gain a foothold in our realm, and I share their determination to prevent such an event from ever coming to pass. I do not wish to delve into details. All that is necessary to know is that these things present a peril beyond imagining. Bersen must be crushed at all costs wherever sighted. Note what he says, a peril beyond imagining. This is an inquisitor writing. These are people who deal, professionally, daily, with demons and alien horrors and chaos gods and tyrannid bioships. A peril beyond imagining is not hyperbole for the Inquisition. It is a specific and considered assessment. The relationship between the growing psyker population and the enslaver threat is something that even the most pragmatic Imperial commanders understand at an instinctive level, even when they don't know the specific history of the enslaver plague. This is why the psyker tithe exists. This is why the black ships were built. This is why the Imperium's policy toward unsanctioned psykers, a policy that looks, from the outside, like extraordinary cruelty, is structured the way it is. Yet because the alternative, the galaxy where psykers are left unsanctioned and unprotected and uncontrolled, is the galaxy that the enslavers eat. Every time a planetary governor decides that their family is too important to hand over a psychic child to the black ships, they are making the same calculation as the governor of Hive Scorpios. Every time a criminal network moves unsanctioned psykers for profit, they are creating exactly the conditions that the Fax Lignae created in the Calixis sector. Every warp rift that opens, every dimensional boundary that thins, every surge of psychic energy that floods the Imperium with new and undisciplined signals, all of it feeds into the same equation that ended the old ones 60 million years ago. The Imperium is not well positioned to handle another enslaver plague at galactic scale. What the mechanisms it has developed, the black ships, the Inquisition's rapid response protocols, the sanctioning of psykers, the soul binding, are all specifically designed to keep the conditions for such a plague from developing, to keep the unprotected psychic population below the threshold that would attract enslaver attention en masse. They work, when they're followed, when the resources exist to implement them, when the communication networks are functional enough to enable coordinated response. In the post-Great Rift galaxy, some significant fraction of those conditions do not hold. The enslavers are not sleeping. The galaxy is lit up with signals they can follow. The dimensional barrier is thinner than it has been since the aftermath of the war in heaven. They are drifting, sensing, waiting for the cascade to begin, for enough gates to open in enough places that the self-sustaining expansion can take hold, that the geometric progression can start its remorseless doubling and redoubling. They have done this before. They have the patience of beings who exist in the warp, where time moves differently, where waiting is simply the space between opportunities. Part 10. The weight of what they are. Themes and significance. Let me step back from the specific lore for a moment and talk about why the enslavers matter so much as a concept within Warhammer 40,000, because I think this is actually where the real richness of this topic lives. The history and mechanics we've been through are fascinating and important, but the enslavers are worth spending time on, not just because they're an interesting piece of lore trivia, as they're worth spending time on because of what they reveal about the nature of this entire universe and the specific shape of the horror that defines it. Warhammer 40,000 is a setting that is absolutely full of apocalyptic threats. The Tyranids want to consume every living organism in the galaxy. Chaos wants to tear reality apart and transform the material universe into an extension of the warp. The Necrons want to strip sentient life from the galaxy to power their solar-scale weapons. There is no shortage of things that want to end the world, or worlds, in this setting. The list of galaxy-ending threats in 40K is so long that at a certain point, the individual entries start to blur together into a general background hum of existential danger. But the enslavers occupy a specific and uniquely unsettling position in this ecosystem of existential horror, and it comes down to a few specific qualities that distinguish them from almost every other major threat in the lore. First, the enslavers have already done it. This is not a threat that has been building toward its first real test. The enslavers already swept the galaxy. They already took civilizations that were, by any measurable standard, vastly more advanced and more powerful than the Imperium of man, and turned them into dust and silence. The Old Ones, who built the webway, who seeded life across the galaxy over millions of years, who mastered the warp in an era when it was still partially manageable, the Old Ones lost. They didn't lose narrowly. They lost completely, civilization endingly, on without any last-minute heroic reversal. The precedent that exists for the enslaver plague as a force in galactic history is complete extinction of the most advanced civilization in galactic history. Not defeat, not retreat, extinction or flight, with no certain way to distinguish between the two. Compare this to the Tyranids, who are terrifying precisely because they have never lost and seem unstoppable, but we are still in the early stages of their contact with the galaxy's core civilizations. We don't know yet what a full-scale Tyranid victory looks like from the inside of it. With the Enslavers, we do. We have the historical record. We know exactly what it looks like when they get everything they want, because they got everything they wanted 60 million years ago. The silence that followed is documented. The ruins of the Old Ones' civilization are out there, on dead worlds, if anyone knew where to look. The evidence is in the archaeological record of the galaxy itself. Second, the Enslavers exploit the very things that make the Imperium's survival possible. Psykers are not just targets for the Enslavers. They are the Imperium's most powerful resources. Astropaths allow interstellar communication across a realm so vast that physical messengers could never keep pace. Navigators carry the mutation that allows human ships to navigate the warp without being destroyed by its currents. Battle psykers provide capabilities that no technology can fully replicate. The Inquisition relies on sanctioned psykers for its most sensitive work. The Grey Knights, the most elite warriors in the Imperium, are all psykers, yet their psychic abilities as essential to their function as their weapons. And above all of this, at the very heart of the Imperium's existence, the Emperor on the Golden Throne is the greatest psyker in human history. His sacrifice and his continued presence, the anchor of the Astronomicon that guides every warp-capable ship across the galaxy. The Imperium cannot function without psykers. It cannot fight its wars, communicate across its vast territory, navigate its fleets, or sustain the essential religious and political infrastructure that holds 1,000,000 worlds together. None of this works without psykers, without the psychic backbone that the Emperor built into his civilization from its foundations. And the Enslavers specifically hunt psykers, precisely, with the targeting sensitivity of something that evolved in a psychic dimension to detect and exploit exactly this quality in real space beings. If you tried to design a predator specifically built to exploit and destroy the Imperium of man at its foundations, a creature that specifically hunted and transformed psykers would be precisely that predator. The Enslavers are not designed to destroy the Imperium. They predate the Imperium by tens of millions of years, but they might as well be. Third, the Enslavers raise a question that 40K asks repeatedly in different forms, but that the Enslavers ask more starkly than almost anyone else. Is there a version of humanity's survival that doesn't require more of the same mistakes? The Old Ones created psychic races to fight a war, flooded the warp with psychic energy, and summoned the instrument of their own destruction. The Imperium needs psychic individuals for its functioning, is becoming more psychic with every generation, and the Great Rift has just made the warp vastly more accessible to things that hunt psychic beings. The parallel is almost structurally perfect. The question of whether the Imperium can break the pattern, can find a way to use its psychic resources without creating the conditions for an enslaver plague, is not one that the setting answers. It hangs in the air, unanswered, and will remain unanswered as long as the Imperium continues to exist in the form it currently takes. The Emperor himself understood this paradox at a fundamental level. His plans, the ones that the Horus heresy interrupted, and that the 41st millennium only fragmentarily follows, appear to have been oriented toward guiding humanity through its psychic evolution in a controlled way, towards something sustainable rather than catastrophic. Whether his approach would have worked is a question that can't be answered, because the heresy shattered the timeline he needed and left the Imperium in a state of frozen desperation that can maintain but cannot truly progress. The institution the Emperor built to shepherd humanity through its psychic awakening is now a 10,000-year-old bureaucracy that confiscates psychic children and feeds most of them to the Golden Throne, the remainder barely trained before they're pressed into service. This is as far from the Emperor's vision as it's possible to get, while still technically using his infrastructure. Fourth point, and this is perhaps the one that resonates most deeply when you sit with the Enslavers long enough. The Enslavers represent something philosophically interesting in a setting that often frames its horror in terms of corruption, of being turned to serve evil gods, of losing yourself to mutation or damnation. The Enslaver doesn't corrupt you. It doesn't want your soul for any higher or lower power. It doesn't turn you into a servant of Khorne or a plague carrier for Nurgle. It simply uses your body as raw material, as structural components for a dimensional doorway. And when that doorway is finished, you cease to exist in any meaningful sense. There's no dark bargain, no moment of temptation, no theological weight. You are useful as a tool, and when the tool has served its purpose, the tool is discarded. The cold, mechanical indifference of this is, in its own way, more unsettling than the passionate malice of chaos. Because you can argue with passionate malice, you can resist temptation, you can hold on to your values against the pull of corruption. Countless heroes of the Imperium have done exactly that, faced the seductive whispers of chaos, and said no. It is difficult, sometimes catastrophically difficult, but it is possible. There is a framework for that struggle. The imperial faith gives it shape and meaning and a language to understand it within. The chaplains and the priests and the confessors all exist partly to provide that framework, and to give people the vocabulary to understand what they're fighting, and the faith to believe resistance is possible. You cannot argue with something that does not care about your existence at all. That finds you about as interesting as a building material. The enslaver doesn't want to corrupt you or seduce you or test you. It wants to use your flesh as a door. That's the entirety of your significance to it. There is no moral framework that applies. There is no faith strong enough to make it care. There is no act of heroism or sacrifice that changes the equation, because the enslaver is not having a conversation with you. It is simply doing what it does, and what it does happens to include consuming your capacity for autonomous existence. This is not a threat that the human mind is well equipped to engage with spiritually. The imperial faith has 10,000 years of tradition around facing chaos, around the struggle against corruption and temptation, and the seductions of the dark gods. It has almost nothing around the enslavers, because the enslavers don't offer anything. No seduction, no temptation, no redemption, no drama. They simply arrive and begin the process. You don't become a chaos cultist and have some part of you still present, still making choices, still in some terrible sense free. You become an enslaver's thrall, and you are simply gone, replaced by something wearing your face and using your voice and carrying your knowledge as tools. This is the darkness that sits at the back of every inquisitor's briefing on the enslavers. The thing that makes even experienced handlers of alien and warp-born threats use phrases like peril beyond imagining, because the threats of the 41st millennium are, for the most part, threats that can be resisted through something, through faith, through courage, through extraordinary skill or sacrifice or technology. The enslavers represent a threat that was already, once, completely unresistible, a threat that consumed an entire galactic civilization without leaving anything recognizable behind. The only reason the galaxy exists in anything like its current form, the only reason humanity evolved, the only reason the Eldari still sing in their craft worlds, the only reason the 41st millennium is even a thing, is that the last enslaver plague eventually ran out of food. That's it. That's the reason for survival. Not a hero, or not a plan. Not a last stand at some pivotal fortress. Not even faith or courage, because the civilizations that had more faith and more courage than the Imperium ever will. The old ones, who had studied the warp for millions of years, didn't survive either. The plague ended because it ran out of targets. The galaxy was empty enough that the cascade self-terminated. We exist because the enslavers ate everything worth eating 60 million years ago. And by the time the galaxy filled back up, the conditions hadn't yet aligned to allow the same scale of devastation to begin again. The word "yet" is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. And now the targets are back. Now the galaxy is full of life again. 60 million years of evolution and civilization building. 100 trillion human beings alone in the Imperium. An Eldari population still numbering in the billions, orcs spreading across the stars in their billions, Tau expanding their empire, Tyranid bioships bringing with them billions of organisms whose psychic absence nonetheless creates the displaced psychic pressure of their prey. Life in abundance. Psychers in unprecedented and growing numbers. The feast is set. Something in the warp has noticed. Whether the full scale of the ancient plague can recur in the modern era depends on 1,000 variables, on choices being made right now by governors and inquisitors and planetary defense force commanders and criminal kingpins and nobles who think their children are special enough to exempt from the tithe. It depends on whether the black ships can keep pace with the psychic awakening, or it depends on how quickly the wounds in reality opened by the Great Rift can be addressed. It depends on decisions that have already been made, that cannot be unmade, whose consequences are working their way toward the surface through networks of cause and effect too complex for any single intelligence to fully trace. The enslavers are patient. The enslavers have been here before, and the galaxy, this time, has no old ones to try to save it. There is one final comparison I want to draw before we close out, because I think it captures something important about the enslavers' place in the 40K cosmology. Every major threat in Warhammer 40,000 is, in some sense, a response to something humanity and its allies did or are doing. The Tyranids are drawn to the galaxy in part by the psychic noise of life within it. Anno chaos feeds on the emotions of sentient beings and is empowered by their suffering. Even the Necrons' hostility to humanity is partly rooted in their desire to reverse the biotransference that cost them their organic existence. An existence that living beings like humans represent by simply continuing to be alive. There is a kind of reciprocity in all of these threats, a terrible dialogue between what the galaxy's inhabitants are and what threatens them because of it. The enslavers have the clearest version of this dynamic. The enslavers are the consequence of psychic civilization, the predator that evolves in response to the prey it is shaped to hunt. They are what the warp produces when psychic life becomes abundant and uncontrolled enough. They are, in a horrible sense, an immune response, the Imperium's way of reducing the psychic pressure being exerted on it by converting the source of that pressure into portals and using it up. The more psychic the galaxy becomes, the more the enslavers are drawn to it. The more the barriers between the warp and reality thin, the easier it is for them to breach. They are not evil in any moral sense. They are systemic. They are what happens when the system reaches a certain threshold. And the 41st Millennium is a galaxy rushing toward that threshold with the momentum of 10,000 years of continuous war behind it. Part 11. Closing thoughts. The oldest and quietest horror. We've been at this for a while now, and I want to bring it home with the weight it deserves. The Enslavers are one of the oldest threats in Warhammer 40,000 lore, predating the setting's other major horrors by tens of millions of years. They were introduced in the very first edition of the game in 1987 in the original Rogue Trader rulebook, one of the first alien entities ever described for this universe, which tells you something about the instinct that went into building this setting from the beginning. Even in its earliest days, Warhammer 40,000 understood that one of the most effective sources of dread is not the monster you can see charging at you across a battlefield, but the process you can't stop once it begins. Rick Priestley and his collaborators, writing in that original rulebook, understood that the warp wasn't just a dimension for travel and psychic power. It was a place from which things came, and some of those things were patient in ways that no human mind fully grasped. But they have received less attention than the Chaos Gods, less spotlight than the Tyranids, less dramatic codex coverage than the Necrons or the Eldari. And I think part of what keeps them relatively understated, beyond the obvious marketing logic of focusing on things that have extensive miniature ranges, is exactly what makes them so frightening. They don't have a personality to dramatize. They don't have a charismatic leader to write novels about. They don't have a clearly defined military doctrine, or a range of distinctive units, or a color scheme for their armies. They are, in some deep structural sense, a condition more than a faction, a plague more than a people. And conditions are harder to make exciting in the traditional wargaming sense than armies. But their place in the lore is absolutely foundational. Without the enslaver plague, the war in heaven might have had a different outcome. The old ones might have been victorious. The Necrons might have been defeated before the Satan could be overthrown. The galaxy's subsequent history might have played out unrecognizably differently. Without the enslaver plague, there is no 60 million year sleep for the Necrons, no power vacuum for the Eldari to fill, no rise of the Eldari Empire, and subsequent fall and birth of Slanesh that reshapes the warp. Without the enslaver plague, the galaxy doesn't evolve new life in the silence that followed. Or if it does, it evolves alongside the old one's continued presence, which changes everything about what humanity becomes and what threats it faces. The enslaver plague is the event that cleared the board. It ended the age of the galaxy's first great powers and set the stage for everything that followed, every civilization that has risen since, every conflict that constitutes the setting as we know it. In that sense, you can argue that the Enslavers are the most important single entity in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore, the pivot point on which the entire history of the setting rotates. Not because of what they are, but because of what they did and what their doing it made possible. The Enslavers are also, I would argue, one of the most effective tools in 40K's philosophical toolkit for expressing one of the setting's central ideas. That the universe is profoundly and impartially hostile to life. Not hostile because it hates life. Not hostile because some deity decided to be cruel, but hostile in the way that a storm is hostile, that a vacuum is hostile. The Enslavers don't hate humanity. They don't hate anything. They are simply predatory entities doing what they do, and what they do happens to be the end of civilizations. Their indifference to human experience, their complete lack of interest in human significance, is a kind of horror that goes somewhere different from the personalized malice of chaos. In the far future, there is only war. But the Enslavers represent something more fundamental than war. War can be won or lost. An enemy can be defeated. The Enslavers cannot be defeated in the way that an army can be defeated, because they are not an army. They are an infestation, a process, a chain reaction that once it reaches critical mass cannot be stopped by anything short of removing all potential hosts. You cannot negotiate with them. You cannot outlast them. You can only prevent the conditions that allow them to begin. And once they have begun, you can only race against the exponential, trying to cut the cascade before it reaches the point where nothing short of fire from orbit can contain it. And in a galaxy that is currently generating those conditions as fast as the Emperor's servants can suppress them, that feels like a very thin line to stand on. I also want to take a moment to reflect on what studying the Enslavers does to your understanding of some of the Imperium's most seemingly inhumane practices. The psychotithe, the black ships, the soul binding, the sanctioning process. These are things that the setting regularly presents as brutal, as evidence of the Imperium's coldness and its willingness to sacrifice individuals for the collective. And they are brutal. There is no way to tell a child that they are being taken from their family and sent to a massive black ship to potentially die in the process of being bound to a god's soul without that being a brutal act. The grief of the families who give their children to the black ships is real and documented, and not something the Imperium treats with particular tenderness. But when you understand the enslavers, when you know the history of hive Scorpios, when you know what happened on Pretasia, when you know what the Nemesis incident cost, the Psyche tithe begins to look different. Not kind, never kind, but rational in a way that transcends the ordinary utilitarian calculus. The Imperium is not collecting psychers because it's cruel. And it is collecting psychers because the alternative is leaving beacons burning in the warp that draw things capable of ending civilizations. The soul binding that kills many of the psychers who undergo it, that brutal ritual where the psycher's soul is linked to the emperor's, where many don't survive the process, is not a punishment or an expression of contempt. It is the most effective known method of reducing the psycher's warp signature, of making them quieter in the immaterium, of making them harder for the enslavers to find. Every system in the Imperium that seems inhumane in isolation makes a different kind of sense when you understand the specific shape of the threats it was designed to manage. The Imperium is monstrous, yes, but it is monstrous in the way that a surgical amputation is monstrous, painful, costly, but destructive, rather than monstrous in the way that a plague is monstrous. The difference matters, even if it doesn't make the experience of living under imperial rule any more pleasant. Next time you think about the Psyche tithe, about those long, dark black ship convoys collecting the psychic children of a million worlds, about the cost and the cruelty and the grief of it, remember what it's for. Remember what happened the last time the galaxy let that kind of accumulation go unmanaged. Remember the 60 million year silence that followed the Old One's mistake. Remember Inquisitor Malin's description of hive Scorpios. 3 days, an entire hive city, one psyche whose father thought she was too important to give to the black ships. The Imperium is brutal about psychers because the alternative is what Inquisitor Malin described, is scaled to planetary and then sector and then galactic levels. The brutality is the price of the protection. It is not a good price. It is simply the only currency available for purchasing a particular kind of safety in a particular kind of universe. And finally,
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.